Hello my beloved friends, and welcome back to the Untold Stories. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a crazy idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the case. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin by Story 1, The Rise and Fall of the Ku Klux Klan. It was 1865. The Civil War had just ended, but the wounds it left on this country were far from healed. The Confederacy had fallen, but the spirit of resistance was far from extinguished in the South. 6 men, each with their own bitterness, each with their own fury, met in the small town of Pulaski, Tennessee, to form something new, a secret society born from the ashes of a lost cause. It was there, in that suffocating southern night, that the first whispers of the Ku Klux Klan began to take shape. They were Confederate veterans, men who had bled and died for a cause that was now gone. Their grief and rage, their sense of defeat, brewed into something monstrous. They needed something to give them power again, to maintain control over a South that was quickly being transformed by the progress of Reconstruction. So, they created the Klan, a group of men willing to use violence and fear to assert their dominance, to keep black people from rising and claiming what they had long been denied. At first, it was small, quiet, but it grew, spreading like a disease. The Klan appealed to the white men who could not stand the idea of black people voting, holding office, or standing shoulder to shoulder with them in society. It was never just about power, it was about white supremacy, a way of life that could not and would not be surrendered. They donned their hoods and robes, cloaking their faces to hide the monster inside, and rode out into the night. The Night Riders, they called themselves, striking terror into the hearts of anyone who dared to challenge their twisted vision of the world. In 1868, with the country still rebuilding, the Klan's violence reached new heights during the presidential election. Across the South, from Arkansas to Georgia, black men and women were slaughtered in cold blood for daring to vote, for daring to live the dream that Reconstruction promised. Whole families were murdered in their homes, their bodies left hanging from trees, their deaths nothing more than a message. A message to anyone who thought they had a right to equality. It wasn't just about black people. The Klan targeted anyone who stood in their way, white Northerners, Unionists, and even Southern whites who dared to support the changes of Reconstruction. They had no mercy at all. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, became the first leader, the Grand Wizard of this abomination. He was a man of great skill in battle, but in the Klan his true evil found its home. Under his command, the Klan took on a hierarchy filled with ridiculous, grotesque titles, Exalted Cyclops, Imperial Wizard, that were meant to add a mystique to the terror they inflicted. They were more than just thugs. They were an invisible empire, a secret society that had become a force of untold power. They wore their hoods, hid their faces, and rode through the countryside like ghosts, striking fear wherever they went. They lynched, they burned, they raped. They tore apart families, destroyed lives, and made a mockery of justice. And they did it all in the name of a lost cause, one they would never accept was gone. But their reign, this first iteration of the Klan, came to a sudden end. They grew too brazen, too violent, and eventually, the government cracked down. By the early 1870s, they had faded into the shadows, their power diminished, their grip slipping away. The laws of the land had started to change, and the promises of Reconstruction still flickered, however faintly. But the Klan never truly died. In 1915, when the world seemed to be shifting in a new direction, the Klan was resurrected in Georgia, under a new guise, feeding on the growing fears of immigration, communism, and the changing fabric of American society. This was no longer just a fight against black people, it was against anyone who didn't fit their narrow, racist ideals. Jews, Catholics, immigrants, all were fair game in their twisted vision of purity. By the 1920s, the Klan had grown to a massive, terrifying size. 4 million members strong, they marched on Washington, D.C., parading their white robes like a deadly snake winding through the streets of the nation's capital. Their reach extended into politics, law enforcement, and almost every corner of the South, even creeping into the Midwest. They burned crosses, terrorized neighborhoods, and used every form of violence imaginable to hold onto power. But like all monsters, the Klan began to tear itself apart. Sex scandals, infighting, and exposés in the newspapers broke them down. Their power waned, and by the 1930s, they were a shadow of their former selves, but still dangerous in their pockets of influence. Then, as the country fought to move forward, to break the shackles of segregation and inequality, the Klan reappeared yet again in the 1960s. This time, it was in response to the civil rights movement. They couldn't stomach the idea of Black Americans gaining the rights that had been denied for so long. Bombings, murders, the deaths of 4 little girls in Birmingham, the murders of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. The Klan was responsible for so much bloodshed, and the world watched in horror as the nation's most vicious domestic terrorists tried to claw the country back into a time of hatred and division. The Klan's influence began to wane in the years after the civil rights movement, but its roots dug deep into the fabric of America, into the very soul of the South. Despite their internal battles and the government's attempts to weaken them, the Klan remained, lurking in the shadows, a ghost that could never fully be exorcised. In the 1970s, figures like Louis Beam and David Duke rose to prominence, pushing the Klan into the era of neo-Nazism and white nationalism. They became more insidious, blending their hatred of Black Americans with a new venomous anti-Semitism and violent ideology of leaderless resistance. The Klan had mutated, evolving from a group of hoods and robes to a far-right extremist movement with a terrifying new mission. But even in their darkest hour, the Klan began to splinter. Infighting, legal battles, and constant infiltration by law enforcement tore the group apart. Smaller and smaller factions formed, and though their violence continued in some parts of the country, they were no longer the massive, all-encompassing terror they once were. Today, the Klan is a shadow of its former self. Their monuments, those sickening tributes to men like Nathan Bedford Forrest, stand across the country, reminders of the ugly past they helped shape. But after years of protests and calls for justice, even those symbols are being torn down, one by one. Still, the hatred they spread lingers in the corners of America, festering. The Klan is not gone, not fully. But maybe, just maybe, their time is running out. Now let's slide to the next story. It's called Burned in Selma. It was 1966, a year after my mother died in the fire. I'll never forget how the house cracked and groaned, the flames licking the walls like they were hungry. It was early in the summer, just after my 14th birthday. The air was sticky with sweat, and the ground had just started to bake under the southern sun. You know, it was always humid there, the kind of air that clings to you, suffocates you. But what you don't expect in a small town like that, in the backwoods of Alabama, is the kind of hatred that seeps out from under the floorboards like that. We lived on the outskirts of Selma, just far enough to be called country folk, but not far enough to escape the weight of history that hung over us like a storm cloud. People used to talk about the Klan, mostly in whispers, but everyone knew it was there. Everyone knew what they stood for. I remember a lot of people tried to pretend that they didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, didn't know anything. But I did. We all did. One evening after the funeral, I was walking back from the store, my eyes on the ground, my shoulders bent low under the weight of grief and heat. That's when I heard it, the slow, deliberate hum of car engines coming from a distance. It wasn't the kind of sound you could ignore, like the hum of a neighbor's old pickup. No, this was different. This was the kind of hum that made you freeze, the kind that made the hairs on your neck stand up, and your heart beat like thunder in your chest. I looked up to see them, a line of black cars, dark and polished, creeping along the dirt road near the edge of our land. Their headlights were off, but the outlines of the men inside were unmistakable. White robes, hoods, shadows draped in terror. I had heard the stories, but seeing them? that was something else. They pulled up to the edge of our yard, and I saw one of them, the man who had been in charge back then, a monster named George Liddell, step out. He had a face that looked like it belonged to a man who had never known the sun. Pale, cold, with eyes that made you feel like you were already dead. He looked me straight in the eye, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Boy," he said, his voice like gravel, "you make sure your family knows who owns this land. You remember that? There ain't no place for people like you around here." His words cut through the night air like a razor. I just nodded, too scared to say a word. I had seen their mark, the burned cross in the field where the land used to belong to someone else. My family had bought it in '53, and ever since, we'd been on their radar. It didn't matter that we were good people, didn't matter that my father worked hard every day to keep a roof over our heads. The only thing that mattered was that we weren't like them. That night, after I went inside, I sat by the window, watching them from the shadows. They stood around the cars, talking in low voices, all of them with their heads covered in that sickening white. I could hear their murmurs, threats, warnings, promises. Then they left. But I knew deep down that they weren't done with us. No, they'd been planning something. I could feel it in my bones, the kind of tension that makes you want to scream, but you're too terrified to make a sound. The days that followed were worse. There were more of them, at least a dozen or more that I could see. They started showing up in the mornings, walking down the road in broad daylight, their white robes so clean, it was like they were untouched by the dirt of the world. You could hear their boots on the pavement, and sometimes they'd stop, turn, and look right at me like they were daring me to look away. But I never did. Then one night, July 4th, 1966, the sky was alive with fireworks. But all I could hear was the low rumble of an engine. They came again, but this time it was different. The air had gone still, like everything was holding its breath. I heard the screech of tires, the low growl of their trucks, then the sound of someone, banging on our door. I froze. My father got up, trying to be calm, but I could see the panic in his eyes. When he opened the door, they were there, Liddell and his men, their eyes full of fire. "Your kind doesn't belong here," Liddell said, his breath hot against the night. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if he was about to take something from my father. "Time's up." The next few hours were like a nightmare. I didn't see everything, but I heard it. The screams, the shuffling of boots, the splintering of wood. When they left, there was nothing left of our home but charred ruins. They burned it all to the ground, every last bit of it, like they were trying to erase us from existence. I stayed quiet watching from the woods. I could feel the heat of the fire on my skin, and when it was finally over, I knew things had changed. My father, my mother, they were gone. The world had swallowed them whole, and no one would ever talk about it again. The Klan didn't need to speak of their sins. They let the ashes do it for them. That was the night they drove us from that town, from Selma. They tried to make us forget, tried to silence us, but I couldn't forget. I couldn't stop remembering their eyes, their voices, the feeling of being hunted like an animal. I was just a boy, barely out of my teens, and my whole life was gone in a single fire. I've heard stories since, seen things on the news, read about the Klan's fading grip in the '70s. People act like it's all in the past now, but I know better. The scars they left behind are still there, buried deep in the earth. They're waiting for someone to dig them up. Waiting for someone to remember. And I will. I'll remember it all. Now we will end this video with the last story called A Night with the Klan in Mississippi. I reckon I ought to tell you this story, though it ain't easy. My hands still shake when I think about it, and the smell of burnt pine and gunpowder still lingers in my nose, even after all these years. This happened back in '27, down in the backwoods of Mississippi, near a little town called Black Hollow. Ain't nobody much remembers it now, but I do. I remember every damn second. It was late October, and the air was thick with the kind of chill that gets into your bones. The moon hung low, full and yellow like a rotten egg yolk. I was just a young man then, barely 22, working as a farmhand for the Hargrove family. They were decent folk, but they kept to themselves, and they didn't ask too many questions. That's why I was out that night, see? They'd sent me to fetch a mule that had wandered off into the woods. I didn't want to go, but Mr. Hargrove said it'd be a quick job. Just follow the creek, he told me. You'll find him. So I went. I took my lantern and my shotgun just in case. The woods were quiet at first, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I kept walking, following the creek like Mr. Hargrove said, but the further I went, the more I felt like something wasn't right. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like bony fingers reaching out to grab me. And then I heard it, a low, humming sound, like a hymn being sung far off in the distance. I stopped dead in my tracks. My lantern flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. The humming grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Men's voices, deep and gravelly, chanting something I couldn't quite make out. My heart started pounding, and I knew I should have turned back, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer, keeping low to the ground, until I saw the light. It was a clearing, and in the middle of it stood a massive oak tree, its branches twisted and gnarled like the arms of some ancient beast. Around the tree, a circle of men in white robes and hoods stood, their faces hidden in shadow. They carried torches, the flames casting an eerie glow on the ground. At the base of the tree was a wooden cross, and it was burning, the smoke curling up into the night sky. I recognized them right away. The Ku Klux Klan. I'd heard stories, of course, everybody had, but I'd never seen them in person. My stomach turned as I watched them, their chanting growing louder and more frantic. And then I saw him. A man was tied to the tree, his arms stretched out like he was being crucified. He was black, like me, and he was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was begging for his life, but the Klansmen didn't care. They just kept chanting, their voices rising to a fever pitch. I wanted to run, to turn and never look back, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching as one of the Klansmen stepped forward, holding a knife. He raised it high, and the moonlight glinted off the blade. The man tied to the tree let out a scream, and then, silence. The knife came down, and the man's body went limp. The Klansmen cheered, their voices echoing through the woods. I felt sick, like I was gonna vomit, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I couldn't let them see me. I couldn't let them know I was there. But then, something happened. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, my lantern slipping from my hand. It hit the ground with a loud crash, and the glass shattered. The Klansmen turned, their hooded faces staring right at me. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, my shotgun bouncing against my back. Behind me, I heard their voices, shouting and cursing, and the sound of their boots pounding against the dirt. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my lungs burning, until I finally burst out of the woods and into the open field. I didn't stop until I reached the Hargrove farm. I collapsed on the porch, gasping for air, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my shotgun. Mr. Hargrove found me there, and he didn't ask any questions. He just helped me inside and gave me a glass of whiskey. I never told him what I saw. I never told anyone. But I'll never forget it. The chanting, the fire, the man tied to that tree. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the sheer terror as he realized what was about to happen. That oak tree still stands in those woods, or so I've heard. They call it the hollow oak now, and folks say it's cursed. They say if you go there at night, you can still hear the chanting and see the shadows of the Klansmen moving in the moonlight. I don't know if it's true, and I don't plan on finding out. Some things are better left in the past. But sometimes,